pillars, not necessarily in any order of importance, of this robust Japan-India relationship is, of course, the shared concern with, to put it frankly, containing China's growing influence and footprint across and beyond the Asian continent. And then, of course, going beyond that, the Quad with the US, Australia, and all of that. So it's not just development, it's not just infrastructure, it's not just business, it's also Asian and global geopolitics. So that makes for a very robust relationship. And of course, the personal chemistry between leaders matters. The Modi-Abe chemistry is well known, and it's true, it's real, they do get along. They're also more or less cut from the same political cloth, which helps. However, the Japan-India relationship goes way back, and it entered its particularly dynamic phase from the 1990s onwards. So it's not just about these two leaders. And I had the opportunity to meet Prime Minister Abe when he visited India. Actually, I met him in my hometown, Calcutta, that few high-level foreign dignitaries come down to. They usually go to Delhi, maybe Bombay as the financial center, Bangalore as the tech capital, and so on. And this was during his first short-lived and not very successful term as Japan's Prime Minister a decade ago. And I could see it was very apparent to everybody that Prime Minister Abe really valued the Japan-India relationship, even back then, about 10 years ago, and was determined to do all he could as soon as he became Prime Minister to take it forward, sending all the right signals. So, that was the context of that. Now, when I'll finish, when Prime Minister May last visited India, it was a relatively low-key visit, which I think says something about the current nature of the and state of the Britain-India relationship. Of course, her gesture in wearing a sari was appreciated, and she certainly didn't go overboard and make a fool of herself with sartorial overkill, as the Prime Minister of Canada did just a few months ago with his whole family in tow. However, you will notice that while Prime Minister May was certainly given much more importance than Prime Minister Trudeau was, the welcome and the attention given by the current Indian government, its political class, as well as the Indian media, to Prime Minister May and her visit was markedly less than what, say, President Macron of France received on his visit to India just a few months ago. Of course, France, it's an important, defense partner for India and all of that, and there are other issues involved as well. But it's worth thinking why the President of France received a significantly higher profile in India than the Prime Minister of Britain did. So to sum up, I think people in Britain, not just the government, not just the political class, but opinion formers in general, need to think long and hard about how to make this relationship more robust. And I think doing something to remove or at least alleviate the irritants, which are very damaging in accumulation, and also to try and find some of those sweet spots, those points of convergence that make for a truly harmonious, robust, and substantive relationship will be critical. So there's much work to be done, but there's also a lot of scope and potential. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just use a quick chairman's prerogative just to push out some points there, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. If you could perhaps keep your comments or questions limited to maybe a minute or two, while also saying your affiliation. So I'm getting the feeling that the visa issue is of importance in a way that I felt when I spoke to Polish friends of mine about the US-Poland bilateral during the Afghanistan war. That was always the issue, is that the security relationship was seen very much through access. But I noticed that Japan and France, which are both said to have strong relationships with India and welcome, the visa issue is not a problem. So in some ways, you have a higher expectation of Britain than you do of Japan, for example, which I'm sure takes students, but not
No,
on any...
I wouldn't say that.
Really? Okay, so I'll push it into a question for you, and then a question. So what can we do? You said a cross-government approach, and I wonder, how would you do that? How would you shape that around resolving the visa issue in a politically realistic way in Brexit Britain? And then in terms of, you know, like you mentioned how Japan and France seem to be doing well. Within the sphere of values and perhaps even infrastructure development, which we will get into in the other sessions, can you say what perhaps Britain can emulate through the way Japan and France are doing successfully? So just those two real quickly, and then we'll open up to the audience.
So just on that, the reason why I think, if you look at the Indo-Japan relationship, there's been an agreement signed between those two countries that have agreed to take 100,000 Indian students into Japan, a historically homogenous country with low levels of immigration that is reaching out to India in a proactive way, very different to the approach to other countries before. And I think it speaks to the importance that they both see in each other, that Japan is taking this unprecedented step. And that is just not felt by Indians when it comes to the UK, because it's a 50% drop, and even though it's gone up recently, it's gone up by a few thousand. I mean, that cannot be discounted. I have cousins who don't want to come here anymore and have chosen to go to Australia to study. So I think it shows that the kind of appeal of the UK, there's a perception that the UK is unwilling, and we can argue over whether that's materially true or not, but there's a perception that that exists. And I think we shouldn't look at visas in isolation to the overall rhetoric around immigration, because it's also use of Section 322 to deport highly skilled workers under anti-terrorism legislation because of minor tax infractions, that then also paints a picture that, well, hang on, if you come here as a professional on some kind of obscure provision, even when the HMRC says you haven't done anything wrong, you can end up destitute and deported. So I think it's all of these things together give a sense that this country is not welcoming of foreigners at the moment, particularly Indian foreigners. So I think, you know, liberalizing the visa regime will go some way towards correcting that. But I'm with you. I think much more creativity is needed about what kind of relationship these two countries have. What are these sweet spots of convergence? There isn't about the past. There needs to be a conversation about the future, and figuring out what that is and what the UK has to offer India, not just what it can get from India.
Well said. Professor Bose.
You know, well, I mean, you asked a very big question that, you know, and obviously there are two issues involved here: the will to make a better relationship and the capacity. And perhaps, you know, Britain, you know, capacity is not easily built or you know, recovered, but you know, the will, you know, that is something that is more malleable. And I forgot to, you know, to mention something in my presentation because I got too long-winded about Brexit and how is Brexit viewed in India, and sort of the Indian intelligentsia, you know, broadly speaking, is aware of Brexit, of course. And I get asked about it all the time. But they don't understand typically the nitty-gritty of it. And usually the question is phrased in terms like, what was the problem? I think it's rooted in a deficit of understanding of the European Union and its pros and cons. You know, I tell them that, well, you know, there's a narrative of oppression and so on, but the understanding generally remains fairly vague, you know, fairly nebulous. But people are aware that something big has happened, and you know, there's been this, you know, falling out and so on. Now, but to come to the point, I think that once Brexit is completed, in whatever form it takes eventually, and we should know soon, if not by this weekend, you know, sometime in the coming months, one needs to remember that India, as a relatively significant country on the global stage, will need to balance its relationship with post-Brexit, standalone, quote-unquote, global Britain, with its relationship, its continuing relationship with the EU, which, after all, however troubled and however dysfunctional in certain ways, is still a bloc of 27 countries, with no further member states perhaps looking to exit in the near future. Now, in this balancing act that India will have to make between post-Brexit Britain and the EU bloc, Britain actually has certain advantages because of the historical link, because our elite language is English, and many other factors. So I believe that post-Brexit British governments, if they play their cards right, and if they, for starters, try to mend this rather negative image of the UK and its attitudes towards Indians, then it could be still a reasonably strong relationship.
Okay, so please wait for the microphone to come to you. So Dr. Isle here in the front, and then Commodore Samir Saxel at the back afterwards, the gentleman who watches you.
Jonathan Isle from the Royal United Services Institute. I must admit, continuing from what John Hemming has said, the more I listen to the two of you, the more I realized that actually, with all the denials about the special relationship, it's a classic case of familiarity breeds contempt. I checked your figures. I did the sort of Trump thing of fact-checking. And let me give you a few fact checks just to sort of pour a bit cold water over this. The rejection rate in the Schengen visa for Indian citizens is 8.9% a year last year, 3 times the level of Chinese applications into the Schengen area. The rejection rate for the Home Office for the whole of sub-Indian continent, which includes Bangladesh and Pakistan, is 11%. This is to put it into a particular context. The visa fee for entering Japan is £90. Again, not a small amount of money. The total aid that Britain provides to India last year was £150 million. The total aid that Japan provided for India was £101 million last year. So on almost every count, the things that you were complaining about are either the things that are applied to India as well by other countries, or indeed things on which the UK actually turns up to be in a more favourable position than what you have implied.
Can I?
But my real problem is that whenever I hear these discussions, always I hear what Britain needs to do. Britain needs to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What does India need to do? How did India liberalize its visa regime with China since it's so dependent on Chinese trade? Is there a sort of a deep discussion about the subject? More importantly, how do the Chinese liberalize the requirements for Indian citizen visas as a result of the booming trade? What does India needs to do in order to improve its relations with Britain, or is it a completely demandeur kind of a relationship?
No, I can just briefly. Sure. Yeah. Just to briefly respond to that, I think we live in a day and age where you can find facts to support any position you want to hold. But what I'm talking about is there's a perception. You don't have headlines in the Indian press saying, oh my God, the UK is not that different to Japan. It charges just as much as Japan. The topic of today is the UK-India relationship. So what we're speaking to is how India is perceived in the UK. Now, you don't have to like it, you don't have to agree with it, you can have facts to argue against it, but there's a great deal of consternation and frustration on the Indian side about these things. So I think that has to be taken seriously, and countering it with facts that say, well, actually, it's, a couple of pounds more than this place, or it's only a percentage difference to this place, doesn't alleviate those concerns. It kind of entrenches them. On your, can I just finish?
It's just a familiarity.
Yes.
Contempt. That's what I say.
Yes.
I agree with you otherwise.
If I could, so on your second point, which is around what can India do, India is an emerging power. So it's the UK who wants, there are asymmetries here. It's the UK who wants this relationship because it's chosen to leave the EU. So yes, India needs to liberalize. It needs economic reforms. It needs liberalization of its own financial policies. There's a lot of work to be done within India. But India isn't saying we want a free trade relationship with the UK. The UK is saying we want a free trade relationship with India. So then I think it is incumbent on the UK to spell out how are they going to be a welcoming environment, not just for Indian students, for Indian business, for corporate interests, etc. So I think this is not to say that there's not more. Certainly the Indians need to think about how they deal with the overstaying issue in a better way. But let's not pretend these are two people who want the same relationship from each other. It's one person saying to the other, we're going to need you once we leave the current relationship we have. And the other thinking, okay, well, what are you doing to make this something that we want to be part of? And at the moment, it's not looking like a good mating.
So I think on that on that note, we'll go to the next question. I think
Sorry, terrible.
There's a lot we could push back on that, given your own neighborhood in India with China. But let's Commodore Saxel at the back, please, sir.
Commodore Saxena, I'm the Naval Advisor at the Indian High Commission. I'd like to thank both the speakers. Dr. Patel, you spoke about UK views of rising India, and Dr. Bose, you spoke about the irritants about about projecting Britain in the Indian media. My frustrations are also with the British media, and I think they're frustratingly biased. Very quickly, if you were to run illustratively through yesterday's headlines, India spent $6 billion on Russian missiles and gets $60 million in trade. That's the Daily Express. And then several stories about supposed meeting between the defense ministers, and 11 members found dead in a Delhi home by The Guardian, and 2 years for rape victims' justice by the BBC, and Virat Kohli will pose India significant white ball challenges by The Observer. And so there's no positive story coming on any single day about rising India in the British media. And I can just imagine that if somebody in India could think of, anywhere in India, anybody could think of a snake curry which could be peppered by mosquitoes today, that will get reported by the BBC day after tomorrow.
Interesting. Professor Bose, you want to have a first swing at this?
Yeah, I mean, he's kind of moved our angle of vision, he's shifted our angle of vision. I mean, the British tabloid press is what it is. I wouldn't say that they especially single out India or Indians for a kind of rough treatment. It's their nature to do so. I mean, that said, you do have a point that perhaps, in the, I studied in the United States, and I did all my degrees there. And there, there was almost total ignorance about India. It was just a blank. And that is not the case in Britain because of the historical connection. And I think you hit the nail on the head that it is a case of familiarity breeding contempt, perhaps on both sides. It's mutual, so it shouldn't be this way that India is represented in caricaturish terms in the British media. I don't think all the British media does that. I think there's very modulated, very sophisticated, coverage of India too in the British media. But I do get your point.
So I'm going to take two questions because we've only got about 6 minutes left. This gentleman here in the front row, and then the gentleman with his hand up there at the back.
Thank you. My name is William Crawley. I used for many years to be with the BBC World Service and currently in the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in London University. I'd just like to ask two questions of the panel, make 2 points, really. One, a very welcome change, I think, by the Modi government in relation to the Indian diaspora, the whole initiative of overseas citizens of India. But I do note that forms a very strong contrast to the attitudes which have been taken by Indian governments over the past 50 years to Indians who have settled overseas under the British Empire. I mean, think of the attitudes of the Indian government to Uganda nations and Kenya nations. Not my responsibility, don't come here, they've said. They came to Britain. Well, a whole community has flourished here, a whole dialogue of both community relations and also of racism has arisen here. It's not a word I like at all, and I think it's very overblown, but it has arisen very much in that. And I wonder if what you think about this change in the Indian government would, under similar circumstances, would Mr. Modi say to Indians who are being expelled from wherever it was,
Fiji,
come here?
or Uganda.
Or would they say, no, don't come here, you belong in Britain? The other point I'd like to make, Professor Bose, I mean, having seen and been involved in both journalistic and academic relations with India over the last 50 years, I think it's been a very, very cooperative time, academic especially. The links between universities, the number of Indian professors and lecturers in Indian and other Western universities, the dialogue about the approach to the study of the Indian past and present, there's been a lot of common ground. What is happening now? The RSS is taking over the agenda in India, is putting pressure on the kind of people who share that dialogue, who share that view with Britain, is putting pressure on minorities, is putting pressure on knowledge, and they are supported to a great extent by the Indian community in the United States. So I think that is a very damaging development, which we need to watch.
Thank you. And the gentleman, there's quite a lot in there. Microphone.
Priyajit Debsarkar, I'm an author on India-Pakistan relationship. My question to both of the panelists will be, you mentioned something about soft power and to identify key, sweet spots. Do you think a case of atonement, which the British government could probably look into coming on 13th April 2019 on the 100th anniversary of the Amritsar massacre? Thank you.
Very serious couple of points, so let's dive right into them. Would you like to choose one section each and keep your remarks limited to about?
I'll let you go first.
So on the diaspora, I think it's really interesting because I think about this quite a bit because I'm part of the diaspora. My grandparents came here from Kenya. So, I don't think the diaspora is homogenous. I mean, no family. Within our family, we have very different views of what we think about Modi and his policies within India. So I think this idea of engaging the diaspora needs more critical interrogation of what that actually means. Because if it means to be critical of the policies that you disagree with in India, are you shut out of the conversation because you're not agreeing with what the ruling administration is currently doing in your kind of name? And my kind of engagement with Indians in India and Indians outside of India is that often Indians in India are more willing to be critical of the administration that rules over them than like my parents who are like 20 years in the past and just like, have a very romanticized idea of India because they spent most of their lives here. So I think it's a knotty thing that needs more unpicking when you say the diaspora can be a channel to anything, because which diaspora, which part of the diaspora, what do they believe in, how connected do they feel to where they came from? Because for me, it kind of came through a third kind of country, right, Kenya. So on that, I think it needs more kind of thinking. On academic cooperation, I agree. I have problems with the influence you see of the RSS on knowledge. And I wouldn't even say knowledge production, it's knowledge reduction in terms of trying to reshape the curriculum, be arbiters of what constitutes knowledge. And I think it's hugely problematic. India has a very rich tradition of a kind of interrogative discourse. And this kind of attempts to impose a particular idea of what the Indian past is, I think is very counter to actually the Indian tradition of kind of having ongoing inquiry and critical discussion. Soft power, I think soft power, the greatest soft power instrument the UK has is education. And I think that's where you're seeing a lot of tension at the moment. So I think education, culture, The UK needs to think about what it means to be a soft power in the world, because as China becomes more ascendant, as India becomes more ascendant, that doesn't mean there's room at the top for everybody in the same way as it is now. Things are going to shift. And I think India needs to start capitalizing on its soft power potential more, because I don't think if you look 100, 200 years from now, it will occupy the same space in international affairs as it does now. And I think that long-term vision is missing. And of course, atonement is important. I think there's a reluctance sometimes to recognize the harm that empire did, and attempts to sanitize, like the Bengal farming, when you have this film about Churchill that basically lionizes him and sets him up as this godlike figure. So I think there's a real reckoning to be had here that empire was many, many things, not just one thing, and to recognize some of the great harm that it did.
Great.
I'll be brief. I've spoken too much already. I'll address 2 points. The first is about the more welcoming attitude of the present government towards the Indian diaspora globally. Actually, this has been carried forward by the Modi government, but it began nearly 2 decades ago under the government, the coalition government led by the first Hindu nationalist Prime Minister, Atal Bihari Vajpayee. That's when this kind of a new look policy, seeing the Indian diaspora wherever they might be as assets, as parts of the fabric of the Indian nation, and as India's cultural ambassadors abroad came to be. So it's not the Modi government that has done this. Modi government has put a greater emphasis on it, but it started in the Vajpayee period and it continued in the 10 years 2004 to 2014 when the BJP was not in power in New Delhi. The annual kind of Pravasi Bharatiya Divas kind of overseas Indians Day that happens every January. It's sponsored by the Union government with much fanfare. And of course, this was a byproduct, this much more welcoming, open attitude towards the diaspora. It was a byproduct of India's opening up to the world, especially in the economic sense, that began from the early 1990s onwards. On the other issue of atonement, I'd be very happy if somebody apologized. I think, I dare say, most Indians would be, happy, but there could be kind of somewhat, contrary and even cantankerous reactions as well. That why did it take them 100 years, to do this, and what difference does it make now? And apology cannot erase the negative baggage of history. So I suspect that some of that reaction would also happen. Now, I think it is much more important actually to focus on where we are today, 2018, rather than hark back to 1919 or whenever. And to reiterate a point I've tried to make a number of times, removing some of the obvious irritants would really make a difference. So let's just, because this is a future-oriented discussion, let's focus on the present rather than the past.
Thank you very much, Professor Bose. Dr. Patel, on that forward-looking note, it does sound as if there are a lot of points that the relationship would need to go through in order to develop in the direction that many of us would like. Clearly, there are not easy challenges ahead. But having said that, familiarity breeds contempt. Familiarity is also breeds familiarity. I mean, we are long joined at the hip, as they say, many hundreds of years of two peoples occupying a similar political space, political entity, whether for good or for evil. Definitely it was not a sheer good. The fact that we have kind of rancorous press, free medias and parliamentarians who are running around with their privileges and so on. I say that in the nicest of ways. So, we do have many common things, and I'm hoping that not just the diaspora, but also that those values themselves will be a common link as the world around us, utilizes and values those values much less. We will need to begin to grow closer. With that, I release you to drinks and a break. We have about a 10-minute, 15-minute break, so let's come back at 3:35. And before we go, can I please ask you to thank our panelists in the usual way? Thank you very much. It's really great. Thank you very much.
It's a very timely discussion, and I compliment the organizers for putting this event together. We are at a very interesting conjuncture of history, with Britain seeking to define for itself and then navigate a refashioned role for itself in the world post-Brexit, and India, with which Britain has had, to state the obvious, long-standing historical links, and India being also poised as an emerging power on the global stage. How this self-redefinition of Britain and its role in the world can connect to India's emergence and India's aspirations.
Well, I think as the world becomes increasingly global, but we have the rise of authoritarian powers and changes to the global rules-based order, it's important for fellow democracies, particularly those with a common history, to work closer together. So we're hoping to bring India and UK, who have a long shared history, not always good, but anyway, we want to bring them closer together, both politically, economically, and this realm of security.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is James Rogers. I am the director of the Global Britain Programme at the Henry Jackson Society, and it is my great honour to chair this panel on Britain and India in the Indo-Pacific. We have three well-known panellists this afternoon to join us, who are going to give us their ideas on a range of subjects in relation to the topic. The first, if I start on your right and move along the panel, is Aditya Dave. He is a research analyst focusing on South Asia in the Department of International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute. To my left, or even to my right, to your left, we have Humphrey Hawksley, who is a leading BBC Foreign Affairs correspondent who reports both for radio and television news. He has been posted in a range of locations in the region, including Sri Lanka, India, the Philippines, Hong Kong, and Beijing. Now based in London, he recently had published his latest book, Asian Waters, which looks at China's expansionist geostrategy in the Indo-Pacific maritime environment. And next to him, we have Dr. Walter Ladwig, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of War Studies at King's College London and a visiting fellow in Asian security at the Royal United Services Institute. He has extensive knowledge of the region and was previously a lecturer in international relations at the University of Oxford. So each of the panelists is going to give you their perspective of Britain and India's role in the Indo-Pacific. Each will speak to you for around 5 to 7 minutes, and then we can move into questions and general discussion. So if I hand over to Aditya, would you mind going first? Sure. Thank you.
Thank you, James, and thanks to the Henry Jackson Society and Democracy Forum for having me here. Just to start, so the India-UK defense relationship has become more of a strategic relationship fairly recently, given the history between the two countries. So in 1995, the two countries signed the Defense Consultative Group Agreement, which moved towards engendering mutual understanding of each other's security interests and greater fraternization between the armed forces of both countries. However, the same language continues to be used even today, with like a fairly limited implementation and limited visible forward movement. In September 2011, the India's Defense Research Development Organization and the UK's Defense Science Technology Laboratory did sign a letter of arrangement to pool their expertise and work on projects together for UAVs, drones, and advanced explosives, etc., which is actually one of the things that India is looking for from this relationship. There is more of the research and development and actually expertise rather than equipment or kit from the British side. This aspect was actually recognized even before Secretary Fallon's visit to India in April 2017, when it was reported that UK ministers have actually recognized that India isn't necessarily looking at purchasing kit, and India isn't necessarily looking at purchasing equipment from the UK through these high-level ministerial engagements, but is more interested in gaining expertise from the UK's long experience of, say, privatization and indigenization within its military services, whether that is in large corporations such as BAE Systems, etc., or even in certain newer elements such as computer systems, data handling, and cybersecurity. The hope is, based on that report, that these engagements on expertise and experience will then create the environment to increase weapon sales in the future. The UK and India have, since 2004, participated in numerous joint exercises, starting with the Konkan naval exercises in 2004, and now with the Army in the current incarnation known as the Ajaya Warrior exercises held on a biannual basis, and the Air Force exercise Indradhanush. Basically, the military culture of India and the UK has a long history, shared history, and there's an understanding that even from non-UK or Indian naval and Air Force officers, that whenever they do engage in joint exercises, there's always this perception that the Indian Air Force and the Indian Navy are looking towards the UK as something that they want to model themselves on. Even though they admire, for example, the US or other Western countries, the UK is something that they are based on, that their model is based on, and they're looking to essentially learn from them. Bearing all of this in mind, the UK and India need to find ways to further their relationship, given India's recent drive towards indigenization, as well as Britain's post-Brexit strategic concerns. In India, even though there has been a long-standing focus on indigenization, it has been very slow progress towards it. However, the current administration has repeatedly emphasized this aspect, and clearly manifested in the Make in India program. The issue with that is in the Make in India program for defense, however, has not been entirely successful, and there has only been about $0.18 million of FDI in defense since the program was initiated. However, there's a longer-term focus on indigenization and engagement that needs to be geared towards this. There are actors in the UK that do recognize this, in fact, and the collective for aerospace and defense companies within the UK, known as ADS, has kind of taken the lead on this and is looking to engage with its Indian counterpart, the Society of Indian Defense Manufacturers, to kind of take the relationship forward. This is something that actually needs to be facilitated even to a further extent, as the foundation does exist already, but it needs to be expanded to a great extent, the relationship, to foster research and development, joint research and development, capacity building, and partnership along these lines. Similarly, in addition to, say, the public sector undertakings in India, in order to facilitate more of the privatization and indigenization, there's a great opportunity to actually partner with private sector organizations in India. And some elements of this do already exist. So BAE has partnered with Mahindra & Mahindra, for example, for assembly, integration, and testing of howitzer guns in India. However, there are several other private sector organizations, such as the Tata Group and the Reliance Defense and Engineering Limited and Larsen & Toubro, which offer several opportunities for further engagement. From what I've gathered based on my discussions with people in the defense industry here, is that the problem isn't necessarily manufacturing in India itself. The problem is about the technology transfer and about, say, concerns around intellectual property rights. And another sticking point in this investment is a problem with the enforcement of contracts in India. In the recent World Bank Ease of Business rankings, even though India did jump several places up to number 100, and this was a point of great pride within India. One metric on which India was pretty poorly ranked was the enforcement of contracts. It ranked number 164 in the world in the 2018 Ease of Business rankings. And there's limited recourse essentially for those who face breaches of contract. And this inherently deters foreign investors, even in the defense sector. Another very prominent sector where India and the UK are able to work together is in emerging technologies in defense. For example, robotics and artificial intelligence and cyber defense and space. Again, knowledge sharing, capacity building, joint research and development in these areas offers a lot of opportunities. For space defense, for example, Indian stakeholders have pointed out that partnership towards framing an international agreement on space, essentially, between India and the UK is something that they would be extremely interested in. Similarly, in cybersecurity, the UK and India have fairly substantial engagement already. There's a Track 1.5 dialogue that does take place, and the computer emergency response teams of both the UK and India have regular interactions. During Prime Minister Modi's last visit to the UK in April, there was discussion of creating a UK-India tech hub within India. And again, however, the problem with many of these initiatives is that in spite of all the discussion around it, the details regarding its implementation remain fairly scarce at this point. There has been a lot of interest, again, emanating from India again, on specifically by the Defense Secretary and now the Chairman of the DRDO, Sanjay Mitra, who has highlighted several areas where UK investment and, again, expertise sharing would be very valuable for India. The recent revamped RFI for the fighter jet that India has put out, Eurofighter Typhoon is again one of the contenders. I'm not sure it's one of the leading contenders, but it is again involved, again highlighting kind of that equipment isn't necessarily what India is looking for. It's looking more for capacity building and expertise sharing, and actually knowledge sharing between both countries as both look to modernize their defense. Between the two countries, there's also more of a need for us to foster interpersonal relationships, as if the UK does look to gain some kind of short-term relationship in the defense sector with India, what it has not done that other countries have done is look towards government-to-government deals. For example, France and Israel are the most prominent examples of countries that aren't the largest, but still have managed to get much better defense sales, essentially, to India. India also does need an injection of modern equipment. Within the Vice Chief of Army Staff's recent report highlighted that 68% of India's military equipment falls under the vintage category. And steps have also been taken by the Indian Ministry of Defense to update procurement procedures by devolving powers within the ministry and service headquarters and kind of reducing some amount of bureaucracy within the structure. One of the things that, again, France and the US have done with India is undertake a logistics exchange memorandum of arrangement, the Limoa agreement essentially, which is something that, again, the UK can look towards and something that both countries would be interested in.
Okay, I have to sort of move on to the next panel.
Let me just highlight the challenges for like a couple of minutes. Yeah, sure, sorry. One thing that has come up as a problem is, again, perceptions, as was highlighted in the previous panel. There has been a perception for several years, in fact, that Indian and UK security alignments do not necessarily match. From an IDSA, so the Ministry of Defense, Indian Ministry of Defense report from 2013 highlights that there are key differences that continue to trouble the India-UK relationship with relation to terrorism, especially cross-border terrorism emanating from Pakistan. However, a lot of these stances have been rolled back in the UK or have been amended, and there is a lot of these misperceptions essentially do not hold much water anymore. For example, Theresa May has recently refused to endorse the Belt and Road Initiative, which aligns with India's stance. And similarly, again, not highlighted in the media enough, but along with the US, suggested the resolution to nominate Pakistan to the Financial Action Task Force grey list. Essentially, going forward, the bandwidth that Brexit takes up, along with perceptions that need to be amended within India as well, is going to determine how the relationship moves forward. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Aditya, for that very detailed overview of the situation as it stands and the prospects for the future. I'll hand over now to Humphrey, who will talk about Britain and the China-India nexus.
Thank you, James. Yes, we've heard in the past sessions about the ravages of the tabloid press, about the Amritsar massacre, and security architecture, trade architecture, and all these architectures that are coming about. I'm going to try and put a little bit of that in perspective, because Sumantra Bose told us that in India there's a deficit of understanding about the EU. Well, I can tell you with me there's a deficit of understanding about the EU as well. So I'm a little bit lost as well. There are two things happening at the moment that I can see. There are all these various deals about visas and trade and all that stuff that's going on in meetings, and Tata and all the rest of it. And there's also a bigger picture that's emerging about democracy and authoritarianism. Now, around the time that we are going to be leaving the European Union, this, I think, has got a bit of time to run. So Britain, when it severs itself from Europe, is going to be up against two choices in the Indo-Pacific. One of it that we heard from Gareth Bailey is that Britain has to be part of the Indo-Pacific security architecture, which means that we will be sending our Navy into the South China Sea. We'll hear more from that, I think, from Walter later on, to test autocratic resolve under the banner of China. At the same time, we are going to need the trade deals in order for the Brexit policy to be successful in any way. We are going to have to secure big trade deals with big Asian countries, they being India and China. Now, a number of stumbling blocks are going to come from that, because as the time is moving on, so China is making more inroads into Asia as far as its leverage goes. It has already essentially got its economic leverage in Southeast Asia. It is now very skillfully and slowly moving into South Asia, and has done since the Brexit referendum to here. We have got, for example, I mean, Pakistan has been in China's camp, as it were, for a very long time, and is still seen as India's enemy. But Bhutan and Nepal were seen to be in India's arc of influence, and no longer are they there. Sri Lanka, which was a very key sort of Cold War thing, is certainly no longer in India or the West's arc of influence, and then there are smaller places like the Maldives. And this is a sort of salami slicing going on, and of course, those of you who are familiar with India will know that the Northeast remains very vulnerable and shares all those difficult borders. So what essentially is going to happen when we want to get that trade deal with China or India, and we are also being asked by America, our other big, we must have a trade deal with it, to be part of this security architecture. From India's point of view, because that is what we're talking about, you've got a number of obstacles there. We heard about the visas, and I was frankly shocked at those disparities, which is a big immediate question. We also had a question from the back about the Amritsar massacre. China teaches its children from school age that they must never be slaves again because of the Opium War. And this is part of their foreign policy narrative. Now, to what extent, you know, the details of the Opium War is true or not, and I'm pulled apart from that a lot, that is an essential pillar of why it does what it does. As India and China become closer, and the Amritsar massacre questions go into the Bengal famine questions, go into the other questions of our colonial past, they are going to come up over the years and become other irritants in this relationship. The other issue there, which is absolutely key, that we heard across here is all these so-called, you know, we're going to invent this weapon and that weapon and sell this weapon and that weapon. India, from back in 1971, has come to the conclusion that the only reliable arms supply it has got is Russia. And in 1962, those of you that of my generation will know that in 1962, when China invaded India, the United States threw everything it had behind the Indian operation to stop China, despite the fact that Kennedy at the time, exactly simultaneously, was fighting the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, anything you want, you can have. The Chinese withdrew from that on the day that Kennedy ended the Cuban Missile Crisis because they were terrified that the Americans would drop a nuclear bomb on them. You would have thought that would have been a shoulder-to-shoulder relationship such as we heard here that Britain or the West is going to build with India. It wasn't, because in 1971 the US sided with Pakistan and the USS Enterprise went into the Bay of Bengal competing against Soviet submarines that were putting up the front for India. And whenever you talk to an Indian official, and I'm sure many of you have, is that Russia now has been a reliable arms supplier, and that is going to continue. So if you take a scenario, and I'll just wrap up now, James, take a scenario whereby 5 years into the future, we, Britain, are looking for all these deals, and something flares up. Supposing there's a massacre in the Chinese Xinjiang area that's uncovered and all over that tabloid press we were talking about. Supposing there's a dreadful something in Kashmir or the Northeast that goes all over our tabloid press. Or a confrontation in the South China Sea. And then India is told by the United States, you're either with us or against us. India is India. It always does its own thing. So it won't be with us. It will go under a non-aligned umbrella doing what it always does. And it will continue to get its weapons from Russia. We hear about the Quad, which we heard about earlier, which is essentially Japan, the US, Australia, and India. What you're likely to get is Japan, Australia, the US, the UK, and France. And then what have you got? You've got white colonialism again trying to put its foot into Asia. And then what happens? I don't know, but I'm just spinning out these scenarios and we heard these upbeat things, and what I'm saying is not necessarily downbeat, but it's a sense of realism, because anybody who's sat in South Block and gone through these discussions and knows this sort of thing knows how it goes backwards and forwards. And I just came back from Washington a week or so ago, and India does not factor into their defense thinking there when they're talking about the Asia-Pacific, which they do a lot. It's not seen as a reliable ally. So I think, having stressed that, probably overstressed it, I'll leave you there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Humphrey, for that increasingly geopolitical perspective. Let's now move finally to Walter, who's going to talk to you about maritime challenges and the rules-based order in the region itself.
Thank you, James. So let me start off. We've used the phrase a whole bunch today, but no one's gotten around to talking about it specifically. Why are we talking about the Indo-Pacific? Where does this phrase come from? Why are we using it now? The reason has a lot to do with geoeconomics. Bringing together the Indian Ocean and the Asia-Pacific is recognition that the economic prosperity of East Asia depends significantly on events in the Indian Ocean, and vice versa. So the Indian Ocean is a key gateway for bringing energy supplies to manufacturers in East Asia. These same waterways are then also a really important conduit for bringing manufactured goods from East Asia to markets in Europe, in Africa, and the Middle East. The Indo-Pacific has also been highlighted recently because it is, of course, the bumper sticker for the Trump administration's Asia approach. And I would differ just slightly with the previous speaker to say that one of the things that's important about the Indo-Pacific from the US, different from the rebalance or the pivot of the Obama years, was by casting things in terms of the Indo-Pacific, the US